Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today. We have Martin, who is our CEO here at UXPin, and as you can probably tell by the opening slide, he's going to be talking about Agile UX documentation best practices based on his work here at UXPin. And with that said, I will pass this over to him.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
And I assume you can see my slides as well?
Yep.
Okay, just double checking. Great. Thank you all for coming. I'm extremely excited to have this opportunity to talk about Agile UX and documentation. The subject of this talk is somehow controversial. In our small, nerdy world, putting together Agile UX and documentation in a sentence is always, a little bit controversial. But we are going to go through the details of that and explain how to actually run an Agile UX process and use documentation to deliver better products to market faster. So I hope you guys can see my slides. Okay. So I'm co-founder and CEO at UXPin. I'm also running design operations team at UXPin these days. My whole background is actually in UX design and psychology. I used to work as an UX designer and UX manager before starting UXPin. These days, I'm focused on design and development at scale. I just love the subject of scaling operations in design and development. I am focused on product strategy at UXPin, but also I'm a 100% design systems nerd. So I'm spending a lot of time these days building our internal design system, running the operations team, so we can actually scale our process ourselves. You might be wondering, what is UXPin? UXPin is the full stack UX platform. Powerful prototyping, agile documentation, full collaboration, all in one place. We started the company with a very simple belief. The belief that with a properly implemented design process, you can actually drastically accelerate the entire product development process. This belief to this day is shaping our product. Our main focus is on the enterprise market. We mainly serve really big companies and really big teams. But having that said, every day, tens of thousands of smaller companies and freelancers use UXPin as well. We have currently a team of 70 people across 2 offices, Mountain View, where I reside, and Gdańsk in Poland, and this is exactly where I'm from. So this is UXPin in a nutshell. Okay, so I'm going to take you today on a journey. Before we'll actually start discussing the subject of documentation, we have to go through Agile UX process, right? What does it mean? How can you run an effective Agile UX process? Then we are going to go through getting ready documentation, and that really means a strategy documentation, right? How to actually get a project ready for development in this very initial phase. So we are going to go through some templates of documents and different methods that you can apply to your work immediately after this webinar. And then my very special subject, which is development documentation, very close to my heart. So we are going to talk about how to actually get design projects ready for development, how to actually serve developers properly so they can just focus on their work. And then I'm going to reveal a little bit about the future of Agile UX and documentation. So we are going to talk about something that I consider personally the absolute future of our industry. Okay, ready? Unfortunately, I cannot see you guys, so I assume that you are ready and you're excited about this short journey. So we are going to start with Agile UX Manifesto. So let's imagine for a second that the year is 2000 and all the people are still a little bit afraid of the millennial error. So all of a sudden, all the computers might just stop working. And a group of amazing developers gathered in the mountains in the state of Utah. That, by the way, that's a true story. This is exactly what happened. They gathered in a resort in the state of Utah. And this group of amazing developers decided to discuss the state of Agile methodology in software development, and set up the foundation for the future of it. So Scrum was already on the market for a couple of years. Extreme programming was already there, right? So Agile methodologies actually existed already. But this group wants to really set up a standard for the future of Agile software development. And well, this is a piece of the original manifesto. One thing that I want you guys to pay attention to is that there's literally nothing about design and user experience here. But there is something that remains unsaid that really tells us what this group was thinking about design. So the screenshot on the top of the slide, this is an actual screenshot from the Agile Software Development Manifesto, a website that has never been changed since the year 2000. And just look at this interesting graphic in the background. It really tells us how much this group of engineers really cared about design, which is not a lot, right? They didn't really care about it. What they care about it was team experience, right? So I prepared a little bit of a chart to tell you how much did they care about team experience. So let's see. Focus on efficiency, focus on experience. So focus on team experience and efficiency of work, and focus on user experience. 100% of Agile Manifesto is actually focused on efficiency. There's literally nothing about user experience. But I want you to know that it doesn't mean that Agile Manifesto is bad and not useful, and we should just forget about it. On the contrary, both team experience and user experience are absolutely crucial for the process of building digital products, right? So I've never actually experienced a good user experience of a product without having a good team experience and efficient process being run on the back end. These two have to go together, and Agile Manifesto will focus on the first one. The second one has to be added to it, right? And this is exactly what is our job as the UX community, adding user experience to team experience. And both matters, and as in every good relationship, both needs to be actually somehow adjusted. Both Agile UX, Agile software development, and user experience design needs to change a little bit in order to actually create a successful relationship, right? And help teams focus on building great products. So how these changes might look like. So first of all, let's think about what is really Agile development all about, right? So we know already that the main focus is on the team, efficiency of work, and the team experience. Fast delivery is the main thing that supposed to be the outcome of the Agile software development process. And then the process on its own is all about continuous delivery of meaningful parts. UX, on the other hand, is focused mainly on users, right? For years in our industry, we would refer to our process as the user-centered design process. Sadly, this term is kind of disappearing on the market these days, but it's still very close to my heart. So UX is focused on users, but UX is also focused on delivering the right thing and realizing the big vision, so actually solving problems of people on the market. So these two kind of seem like the opposite ends of the spectrum. But in fact, if we'll just do a little trick and we'll just connect them together, we'll have something that seems meaningful. So efficient collaboration aimed at customer happiness definitely makes sense, right? This is what we would like to see. Teams working together, working on delivery of something that makes users happy, right? As simple as that. Delivering the right thing, but delivering it on time. Of course we want that, right? And then delivering meaningful parts, but always with the big vision in mind on the horizon, so we can actually make progress towards the big vision. All these three simple statements together, in my opinion, define what Agile UX is, and also define what a good user experience design practice is. So good Agile UX is really no different than good user experience design process. So this is what we are going after, right? This is what we want to see at our company, at UXPin, but also I'm like, this is what I just want to see on the market, right? This is what I feel is really important for the future of Agile and future of user experience design. Now, how to actually achieve that? There's a very simple recipe that I formed for us at UXPin, but I think you can apply that anywhere. So first of all, you have to take care of the process. And there are three easy things here to take care of first. One, the synchronized sprints, right? You have to create space for design work to be done. And then there's a specific way to actually desynchronize sprints so design work can always be done, not just front-loaded at the very beginning of the process. Two, if you desynchronize your sprints, you gotta trust your team, right? You have to delegate the power down to triads of leaders. So we're going to discuss that. Finally, you have to run a real process. And the real process is structured, predictable, transparent, and collaborative. So if you have desynchronized sprints, if you have leadership triads without a proper process, this is not going to work. And trust me, we tried it, it doesn't work, right? The structured process is necessary. Even if you would cover these 3 points, it's still not going to be optimal. And this is where documentation actually comes in play. So first of all, you have to keep your team on the same page, meaning that a little bit of a strategy documentation must be put up front and then changed in every iteration, but the team has to just stay on the same page thanks to this document. And then you have to optimize the simple process of working with developers, and you have to make it as automatic as possible. And then finally, I don't want to reveal too much just yet, but you have to gradually bring the future of Agile UX to your process now, starting today. So let's talk about the synchronizing sprints, right? It sounds nice. It sounds a little bit maybe enigmatic. It's really hard to decipher that term, but it's really a very simple idea. Typically, people in the industry refer to this desynchronization process as the sprint zero, right? There's a very simple reason why I just recently stopped using the term sprint zero. It suggests, in my opinion, just front-loading design work in one closed sprints that happen before development. And I would consider that one of the biggest mistakes that any UX team can make in the Agile software development process. If you front-load design work and then designers just disappear from the process, you will end up in trouble before the end of a project, right? Design is a continuous activity that needs to be run about a sprint ahead of development, but it has to happen throughout the entire process, right? So that's why I prefer to actually just talk to people about desynchronization rather than some separate sprint to put design activities to. And I know that this is not a definition of sprint zero, but this is what I see in other companies, what people do. If there's something with a number zero, it seems that it's outside of the typical spectrum of the rest of the work. So this is not what we are going to do. What we are doing at UXPin and what I would like you guys to do, it's really to just desynchronize sprints. So design always stays ahead, but development, as much as they can, provides creative support. They're exposed to every single idea. They help and provide their own ideas how to solve user problems. They have access to research, right? And that happens in cycles. So sprints 2, there's another cycle in which development provides this creative support, and they can at least observe how design is being put together. And like good Agile UX process has a certain pattern, and this pattern tends to be repeated in every single iteration, right? Every single sprint. And this is roughly how it looks at UXPin, right? We always start with research. Research might equal usability testing, but sometimes that's all about actually going through data that we already have in the system, right? Search logs, analytics data, customer service emails, right? So that's we tend to structure and categorize so we can actually browse through them. So any kind of information coming from users is treated as a research part. That serves as an input to prototypes. Prototypes are being always tested with users, and only then we actually invest in high fidelity design which goes to, of course, development, and then we're working with developers and actually putting it together. Naturally, Agile software development is not that strictly structured, right? So sometimes development happens before the entire HiFi design is completed because that's the fastest way to actually build it, right? So this collaboration between designers and developers needs to be ongoing, right? And we are really willing to break the boundaries between teams. There are no boundaries between teams, but we are willing to break the process in order to actually spark collaboration, right? Roughly, the pattern exists, but there are places to actually compromise, right? What we don't like to compromise is having a research, right? That's a very, very important part of the process. But even having that said, the process not always gets that structured, right? Some things naturally, we take shortcuts, right? Some things just don't really immerse in the process because we have to optimize for the overall team experience and efficiency of work. And this is what I think we can call it a rule, although I like to say that there are no rules in software development, but let's keep these two as rules. So first of all, if you want to run a very successful Agile UX process, you have to optimize for team's happiness and productivity, meaning that you have to compromise on certain aspects of the process if this is actually making your team happier and more productive. And then the only thing that you have to remember that you just cannot compromise on is front-loading research and design work in one sprint, right? You want to just be ahead, but continuously work on design activities throughout the project. So very simple, almost, it's straightforward, very intuitive, but somehow what we did in the past and what I experienced in other companies before UXPin as well is that people tend to overcomplicate this part, right? So either they become too strict or too loose, right? And then projects just get lost, and unfortunately the result is by far suboptimal. So two simple things to remember: optimize for team happiness and productivity, and do not front load design work. And then you're ready to go with your desynchronized sprints. But if you have this process, that's really not enough to run a successful project. And it's all about actually distributing the leadership. So the way we do it, once you have this very simple desynchronized sprints process in place, then you have to delegate the power to your people. You have to trust them. And how does it look in practice? Every single project at UXPin, absolutely every single one, is being started by a triad of equally important leaders. There's a design lead responsible for experience of users. There's a tech lead responsible for overall reliability of software and, of course, delivering the software to the market. And there's a PM lead responsible for time and quality of the process, right? So we have to deliver on scope and on time. These three leaders are equally important to the process, and they have to work together and collaborate and spark this collaboration across the entire team. That's their task. And thanks to this simple leadership structure, the team starts to own the project right from the beginning. So we don't have this typical waterfall problem where the ownership of a project does not actually belong to the team. The ownership is represented by some kind of power structure higher in the company, and then the team is just responsible for the hard work. With the leadership triad, you have this ownership on the team level. And this is great, right? Because they care about what they do, right? And then, of course, people who are really knowledgeable about their part of the process are in charge, which is also very good practice. Now, there's only one problem with the leadership triad, which is actually forming it, because it's an extremely delicate balance. As you can imagine, if one of these leaders in a triad is more charismatic than the remaining two, then you won't have a balance, right? Somebody is going to pull the project towards one direction. And this is the danger, right? So the whole idea of leadership triad is that these three leaders are balancing themselves, right? So together, they actually run a balanced process. If, for example, tech leader is much more charismatic, influential, active than PM and design lead, then you might actually end up in a project that is just perfect technically, but has not been done on time, and the experience is also not perfect, right? So you have to just strive for the balance. There is no easy way to actually do it apart from just know your people, right, and try to form triads that actually make sense together, right? Sometimes that happens frequently at UXPin. Individually, certain leaders are great, but if you put them together, they can't really work efficiently on a project. So we have to just mix things up and find the right balance. And that's really the only problem with leadership triad. The rest works perfectly in our opinion. But somehow, after introducing this desynchronized sprints and leadership triad, we still didn't feel that our agile process is really smooth. And historically, what happened just after that, we hired a very experienced VP of product coming from companies like Microsoft. And the first thing that she actually decided on is putting a very structured process together so people can know what to expect from every single part. They can see the information flow. And the chart that she drew for us looks like that. And like it's complex, right? It really describes every single step in the process. It describes the project flow, but also information flow throughout the company. But now this project, this process, this chart represents two very important concepts that you might want to put into your processes at your companies, right? And or hopefully you can already see these things at your companies. That would be amazing. So first of all, look at this little curved arrows on almost every step. That means that part of the process is defined, iterations are defined as part of the process, right? They're expected. We're supposed to collaborate with each other, rethink ideas, and until we are actually very happy with the end result. On every single step, we plan and we actually empower people to collaborate and iterate on their ideas. And second idea is that second important thing about this chart is that it defines every step, not to just like have a complex chart, but really to bring transparency to the process so people can know what to expect from every single step in our projects. So this process, once we actually started to run it, changed absolutely everything. And I know it's a presentation, so you might expect a little bit of magical thinking about stuff, but it really drastically improved our efficiency immediately after introducing it. So it felt like magic to me. Coming from a design background, I always kind of I didn't feel comfortable with really structured overall product development processes. But somehow this structured thing starts to work. And why? It's very simple. Good process is focused on transparency. So the structure delivers the information to the team and collaboration. And if you have these two things in your process, things will start to go on smoothly, right? So this scary chart, this complex chart was really about introducing transparency and planned collaboration throughout our process. And this is the whole magic of Agile UX, right? So if you have the synchronized sprints, leadership triad, and a process that aims at introducing transparency and collaboration, then you have a solid foundation of Agile UX. The missing component is documentation. And as you might remember from Agile Manifesto, there's this famous sentence, right at the beginning of it: working software over comprehensive documentation. And this little statement gets quoted as an argument against documenting anything in the Agile software development process. Now, the irony of this situation is that this quote is somehow incomplete, because just a couple of lines lower, Agile Manifesto, the original document, actually says that although engineers who formed Agile Manifesto value working software more, they don't deny value of comprehensive documentation. So this is very interesting because it made the statement much softer, right? It's not like they decided to eradicate documentation. they just decided to focus on working software. And it's hard to disagree with that, right? There's, of course, we value more of working software than documentation, right? Of course, we prefer to see results of work than rather documenting everything. So I would say that an important thing to, whenever you think about documentation in Agile process and somebody argues that there shouldn't be any documentation, the important thing to remember is there shouldn't be in the Agile process this like stack of papers that is always outdated and nobody really cares about it, right? And it limits creativity of the team and it's just a waste of time. Like this kind of documentation absolutely should disappear from the Agile process. What shouldn't disappear is keeping people on the same page with really lightweight documents so any member of the team can understand what's supposed to be built, right? So so this documentation, let's just forget about it. This is old-fashioned. This is coming straight from waterfall. But there's a different kind of documentation which really, really makes sense in the process. And we'll talk about it right now. So the first kind is the strategy documentation, right? So this is what we are going to focus on right now. So this is what I defined in our little roadmap for the talk as the getting ready documentation. So we have two things here at UXPin that we continue to use in every single project. So first of all, light strategy documentation. So how does it look like? First of all, it keeps team on the same page, right? So really the goal is keeping people on the same page. And the way we do it is through defining roles on the team, defining goals, and basic user problems. Then there's always a notion of KPIs, like how do we really recognize success, right? So metrics that we are going after with the particular project. And then defining the full success in terms of a story, like what are we going to deliver in order to meet these KPIs. So very simple documents detailing these three things and taking these three things as goals. The way it's typically represented, it's linked to a lean roadmap, right? So, in a waterfall development, and I used to work for a company running a waterfall process, a roadmap would be 12 months ahead. This is something that we strongly disagree with for a very simple reason, right? So things change way too quickly on the market, internally, to actually keep such a long roadmap. We keep our vision, right, years ahead of the current version of the product, but we keep roadmap only 2 to 3 months ahead. And with that, the roadmap is easier to actually up to date, right? The roadmap gets shared through a little tool called ProdPad, which entire team has access to, and anybody can see what we are actually working on across the entire company. And then every single change on the roadmap gets actually updated, gets sent over email as an update. And these updates are not only about the substantial changes in the roadmap, they're also about our progress towards the next item, the next milestone on the roadmap, right? So that's why they're weekly. So we are keeping the entire team on the same page with this lean roadmap, which is part of the overall strategy document. Now, going back to the concept of this little strategy document at the beginning of the project, we're calling it short PRD, right? Kind of a play with a product requirements document back from the waterfall days, but in a much more concise way. So there's a free template that you guys can access from this little link here. Jerry, you can post it on chat. This is the template that we are actually using at UXPin to define every single project, right? So as I mentioned, goals come first, right? So they define why a particular product or project should really exist, right? And then what does it mean really for the company to deliver it? What is the success of this project? Then, of course, I mean, like every single project should be focused on problems of users, but we only define the main ones in this document. We don't want to distract the team with tiny problems that are connected and might be important, but they're not crucial for the entire project. Dependencies, our project managers like to always keep track of everything that can actually affect the overall timeline, right? So they just keep it real. And then project schedule, right? So which parts of the particular project might get delivered when, right? So there is a scheduled component in our PRD. So this simple document goes to another tool called Confluence. But before we'll get there, structure user stories. So I want to just pause for a second here and tell you about how we are actually putting user stories together. How do we describe problems of users in this little strategy document, and then we're sending it to Confluence. So a little thing, just a detail that we changed in the typical way to describe user stories in Agile development, which typically, I mean, like it's as a user, I would like to do this and that, right? So we kind of changed order, and we are starting with the goal, right, with the action, not with the noun, right? So we are starting with a thing that user wants to achieve. So to give you an example, let's say that we are designing interaction module for UX Pin. So the user story would actually start with the mere action, right? So so user wants to make a design interactive, right? And then who is this user? It's probably interaction designer. And then once you do that, and there's a context component, right? So very simple way to describe a user story. Okay, so once we have this document ready, we are sending it to Confluence, right? And Confluence is really a wiki kind of tool, but the way we are using it, we're just dropping whole documents there, right? So this is an example of our short PRD used as a kickoff document, right? Why we do it? I mean, it's all about transparency, right? So we want our team to have access to every single project, so they can understand what and why and for whom we are actually building at UX Pin. So Confluence is part of the process. And this is the whole stack, right? So told you about Protpad, I told you about Confluence, right? Naturally, you know about UX Pin. But then every single project is being run in target process, right? So this is a kind of like an information flow in UX Pin, at UX Pin. And then, like our design files, prototypes, our design system, and all the development specs are being kept in UX Pin, right? So all of this is nicely linked together. All right, so we went through the product management part of documentation, right? So we have an Agile process in place. We have our strategy described in a very simple document. The roadmap is also has been communicated to the team. What's next, right? We're starting a project, and now the battle really starts, right? And this is something that I feel very passionate about, which is how to actually document any design asset without spending a lot of time on it, right? So developers can understand the entire context of every single design decision, right? And also can access the right information that they need during development. So we'll start with a little bit of an old-fashioned concept, right? So we'll start with redlining. So why would anybody spend time on redlining? First of all, I mean, the goal of MDB documentation is making developers' life easier, right? Redlining is actually meant to make developers' life easy, but it's tedious, it's time-consuming, right? And it's just so boring. But also the goal of this kind of documentation is to eliminate quality assurance back and forth, right? By contextualizing assets, we can really detail of what's supposed to be built, and then we are decreasing the probability of any errors in the process, right? So instead of actually just going back and forth and discussing whether this particular element is supposed to look like this or like that, during the development, we can actually eliminate some of these tiny decisions with just properly documented assets if we don't have to spend too much time on it, right? And then finally, securing design consistency, right? So good development documentation actually lets you plan for consistent experience, right? And this is absolutely crucial whenever you think about scaling your design operations, because if you are growing the team, if you are scaling the process, then consistency will suffer unless you will actually plan your process around keeping design consistent. Okay, so I'm sure you guys are super at least as excited as I am about redlining, right? I used to do it as a designer. It's a terrible process, you know, and it gets extremely complicated around interactive assets, and interactive assets typically actually need more redlining than anything else. So let's load a little fragment of a design. And this is just, you know, like this is a property panel from UXPin. So just a piece of our design. It could be anything. So you can see it's interactive, right? And click around. Now, to redline something like that, and it really needs redlining because it has states, right? There are interactive patterns, something that has to be communicated to developers, so nobody can miss every single detail here. So back in the days, you know, what would happen as the next step? Somebody would actually take this prototype and just start describing what's happening here, right? So if there's a specific class responsible, let's say for tab navigation, somebody would note that on a site. If there are certain properties, which obviously needs to be precise, and we want to just make developers' life easier, somebody would just draw up the props over here. And if there's any context, anything that the developer should know about, then is being dropped on the site as well. Very tedious manual work that takes a lot of time, and all the designers that I know, including myself, always hated this process because it just felt so wasteful, right? So after spending weeks on actually designing something, we had to spend weeks redlining the same stuff, right? So it just felt like such a waste of time. So redlining should not happen without automation. It should not be part of any process. And let me show you how that is possible and how we can automate redlining of interactive assets, right? So there's a bunch of tools on the market which work on with flat files, right, coming from Sketch. But how do you redline interactions, right? So let's switch. This is UXPin, right? So we can switch to here on our preview to spec mode. And what's happening? UXPin is actually generating the redline completely automatically whenever anything gets designed or uploaded from Sketch, right? So UXPin takes the CSS properties and presents them here. Now you can inspect every single item and get the production-ready CSS right here and all the properties and all the measurements, right? But now an interesting thing happens when you click on an interactive assets, right? Then you have access to states. So you can click and change the state from hover, right, to normal state, and you can always access all the properties, right, from any interactive state of an element. So that all of that gets generated, right? So designer can just focus on designing the interface, right, building the interactive experience, testing with users, iterating on every single aspect of the design, and redline is always there, right? Whenever you change something, redline gets generated, right? And what I, as a designer, I really like about it is just this focus on interactive patterns, so I can actually get all the properties from every single aspect of the of my design, right? So very simple thing. I mean, like it requires zero work from a designer, and then we are done with one particular aspect of documentation, which used to be so painful, right? Developers typically, when they get this kind of documentation, are extremely happy, right? They don't need anymore to go into Sketch or Photoshop, right, and manually check all the properties of every single element. And you guys know how we designers are when it comes to keeping order in our layers in Photoshop, right? I mean, like, it should happen, but sometimes it just doesn't, right? So we are actually tormenting developers with messy PSD files that they cannot really properly traverse. So the answer to that is just automated redlining. And you know, we introduced it some time ago. Our customers are extremely happy about it, and we feel like we actually made development a little bit more efficient, right? Internally, it was just a game changer for us. But throughout research with our customers, we noticed something else, something that is off, and that's contextualized documentation. So um, going through designs with our customers, discussing the processes that they run, we started to notice that plenty of them, they just leave documentation on the side of their design assets, right? There's always more that they want to express and share with the development team. There's always more that needs to be communicated in order to make the development process very efficient, right? So these little notes left somewhere on the design, like this is something that plenty of companies do on most of their projects, right? Now, what's wrong about it? I mean, like of course, like communication part cannot be really discussed, right? This is an important part of the process. But the placement of this documentation is a trouble. And here's why. So if you're leaving your contextual documentation in your prototype file, somewhere on the side, it essentially means that you cannot anymore use this file easily for the purpose of user testing, right? Because it has documentation on the side right now. You can try to, like just hide all these layers before testing, and then you need to remember to always make them visible before you actually share this with developers. So there's a lot of extra work, tedious work that you have to do with this documentation before you will actually pass it to development or just share it with developers so you can work together on the rest of the project. That clearly doesn't work, right? It creates complexity in the process. So we decided to solve it. And here's another little example coming from UXPin, right? So we'll generate we are going to load this little piece of design. I'm going to show you how this documentation can be taken care of, and then we are going to talk about what actually can be documented in that way. So here's our familiar piece of UXPin interface. And now there's a change, right? There's a documentation tab and there's an orange dot here. So after you click here, you get access to contextualized documentation. So whatever like our customers are putting on the side of their projects in prototypes can be actually transferred to this little column. So let me show you how does it work on the editor end, just so you get a sense of that. So this is UXPin editor, right? And there's a tab here as well, documentation. And you can just click anywhere, right? Start writing, and then you can attach this to anything on your design. And that's ready, right? So very simple way of actually building this contextual documentation in no time, right? Right inside of your design tool. So this is a very simple concept, very straightforward, based on what we've learned from our users. Now, what actually, what can you put into this kind of documentation? What should you have there, right? That's a question that we might have here, right? So the most popular thing that we are seeing in our customers' work, but also like how we use that internally at UXPin, is just having some sort of an implementation guidelines, right, in the documentation. If there's if particular pattern has been used somewhere else, right, you might want to refer here. If this particular pattern has some states that were not being designed, but they exist somewhere in your ecosystem, you just drop a note here, right? If there are any legal guidelines that you have to share, you just do it through this documentation. And something that I really like is just listing possible compromises. Whenever I design something, I just use this documentation to drop a couple of notes about parts of the interface that are optional, right? Or there is a possibility of a change if it's going to, for example, just accelerate development, right? Sometimes you consider two options that are equally good for the user, and then you are thinking like, okay, like whatever is cheaper for developers, whatever they can develop faster, will go, right? So you can just just leave a note for developers here that they can decide on that, right? And finally, notes from past tests with users. That's probably my favorite one, right? So if particular piece of interface was important to the overall user experience, you want to leave this note and share it with developers so they can also have access to this information. So all of that together, it really forms contextual documentation, right? And the goal of that is delivering all the information necessary to developers during the Agile process, right? So they can have access to the every single information that they need to build the product. So to sum up Agile documentation, first of all, it's gotta be minimalistic, right? You don't think about document everything that you can document, just document the necessary information. Document as little as possible, right? Um, as much as you can, make everything automatic, right? Manual documentation, it's necessary for contextualized documentation, but redlining should get automated, right? Documentation has to be accessible, right? So you want to actually keep it in a place that is fully accessible to the entire team, right? So you guys remember that we use Confluence to share the entire documentation, and then documented design assets are being kept in UX Pin. So our team knows where to look for every single part of documentation. And then documentation should be really development centered, meaning that the main goal of documentation is really to make the process of building products faster, right? So it should deliver information that is important to your developers. So very easy concepts, right? Very straightforward. This is what Agile documentation is really all about. Now, let's talk about something futuristic, right? So what is the future of Agile UX documentation? I mentioned that at the beginning, that we are going to finish this talk with a vision of the future. So ready? Hopefully you are ready. So the future of Agile UX documentation, in my opinion, is completely automatic documentation with design systems. And now you might be wondering, or some of you might be wondering, what is a design system? What does it really mean, right? How do you define design system? How design system can be used for automatic documentation? Well, design system is actually easier to be presented than defined, right? But I like this definition. So design system is an architectural core of digital products. It goes through every single product in your product portfolio, and it increases design and code consistency and just eradicates any repetitive work, right? So very simple concept, which is much more difficult to introduce, right? But especially right now. But the whole point of having a design system is to actually make experience more consistent and make the development process faster. We've done a ton of research around design systems. We are building our own design system right now. I'm sharing this story on Medium if you're interested. At the end of every single sprint that we are having internally, I'm just sharing my notes and observations and results of the sprints. But before we started to build our design system, we actually analyzed over 30 public design systems to just understand what different companies typically put into a design system, right? And we actually found out that there are three logical parts to every design system that we analyzed, every single one. First of all, they're building blocks, right? So most granular parts of any user interface. Typographic scales, color palettes, grid definitions, any image assets, right? Things that are included in every single pattern in your UI world, right? Let's say. Then you have UI patterns. And UI patterns might be, like divided into different categories. Like if you're a fan of atomic design, you would see molecules and organisms here. We like to actually keep it a little bit simpler when it comes to just vocabulary, right? So we have elements, so the most fundamental, smaller parts such as buttons in the system. Then we have components, which are built from elements, modules built from components, and templates built from modules, right? So a very simple structure. And then every design system actually describes roles, right? So it's not only about just keeping this little stuff consistent and having a UI pattern library. It's also about defining the rules so design system can grow, because design system it's not really a thing that you just do once and then you just go on with your development. This is something that you run alongside your process as a separate project, and you keep growing it together with your product teams. And typical rules are design principles, right? If you use them, I do love design principles. I think they're setting up the ground for any design work at your company. Implementation guidelines, editorial guidelines quite often, right? So design system also sets up rules. Now, I think we get a sense of what design system is and what is included. That's an example from our internal design system, right? So just to let you know, like color palette, and I'll show you patterns as well. All right, so that's something that we use internally. So everything gets well defined. I have some connection problems. I'm sorry about that. Okay. So all the patterns get defined nicely in a design system, right? And they're divided into these categories that I told you about: elements, components, modules, templates, right? So a very, very simple thing. Now, how design system can be used to automate documentation? What do I really mean by that? Well, this is getting really slow. Okay. So there we have our familiar piece of UX Pin interface, right? And we'll go into spec mode again, but there will be something different right now. So once I will click on a button, for example, there's a new tab here called specification, right? Let's click on that. And this button has all the information coming from a design system that is used for development, right? So real CSS, some guidelines for implementation, and this is coming straight from a design system, right? It's kind of a beta, more or less, but it illustrates the concept, right? So the concept really is, let's switch here to our, okay, oops. Okay, let's switch here and see how does it work, how can you build that, right? So we have a piece of UX Pin design system here. I can just drag and drop a button. And an important thing is that documentation is actually assigned to every single pattern in the system. And then it actually follows every single implementation of this button, right? So thanks to that little trick, whenever you're designing anything with pieces with patterns coming from your design system, your design gets automatically documented, right? And that works like a pure magic. So we have this implementation of a button just appeared on the screen, right? And this documentation followed this particular pattern, right? So design system, by definition, I told you about the rules. I mean, like design system always consists of particular implementation documentation and code snippets that get synced with development environments, right? And then what I considered the absolute future of design practice is actually keeping these all things in sync and making sure that whenever a designer designs anything with patterns from a design system, they get the documentation, right? And developers can see all the documentation assigned to these assets, right? So it just simplifies the entire process, and it also means that from our standpoint, from the design standpoint, there is no manual documentation anymore, right? We get everything from the design system automatically. So this is the very simple concept. Let's just summarize that, and then I will let you guys ask some questions. So in my opinion, the future of Agile UX is, first of all, a systems first design process, meaning that design systems building process runs alongside all the projects and constantly feeds new patterns and new elements of the design system to the project. Design system on its own should be built with an agile process, which is almost like a next layer in Agile UX world, right? We don't only have to think about building projects, we also have to think about building a system that then feeds all these projects with consistent patterns, rules, and building blocks. And then documentation travels from a design system to a project and always stays in sync with development. So that's what I'm really excited about. This is what I consider the future of our industry. and it's definitely part of the Agile UX world. And that's it. This is what I wanted to share with you. The future is really close, trust me, and like it's coming up. Like we have plenty of companies in our industry these days invest a lot of money into design systems, right? It's already happening. Design systems are important and are here to stay, and I think they're going to change everything in the way we design products. Cool. Okay. Thank you so much for your attention. Sadly, I cannot see you, but I hope you have questions. So let's do that now.
Great. Thanks, Martin. Yeah, we have quite a few good questions here. All right. So let's get into some of these questions here. So let's see. Wow, we have a lot of questions. So one interesting question is about design systems. And actually, I just remembered before we go in here, we've got a poll here. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. And yeah, go ahead, everybody, and feel free to fill this out. This is really useful for us to know as we're developing content, just to make sure it's relevant to what people are experiencing and also the current tools and processes that they follow. And of course, we also have a online Slack community. So if you have more than 3 years of experience in a product team, we encourage you to apply to Product Tribes, which is a community of over 3,000 designers, developers, and product managers. And I just dropped the link there. And now let's get into the questions. So going back to design systems, Penelope has a question about whether, in your experience, the design system also acts as a repository of coded elements and components.
That's a great question, and ideally, yes. So as I mentioned, we are in the process of building our own design system at UXPin, and to be frank with you guys, the way you can think about the code repository is really twofold, and a part gets to be much easier. The first part gets to much easier than the second one. So if you think about the code repository, think about first like a pure front end part, right? So your style sheets, and that's an easy part to change and keep in sync with your design assets. So at UXPin, for example, we actually first we had really well structured style sheets. We are using less, right, as a preprocessors. Our team planned a very neat architecture. So we have all the less files divided into elements, components, modules, and templates, and everything is really nice and clean, very readable. Awesome, right? Connecting that to design, easy, right? We are just taking all the pieces and just rendering them as design components. Now, with having that said, that sync is not complete until you actually work with the JavaScript. If you're on the web development end, right? Until you work with JavaScript part, right? And now we are getting close to have a full sync, but we're not quite there yet. And we are only close because our development team, decided over a year ago to switch to React.js as our JavaScript library, right? So that was a very important step, because with React.js, JavaScript uses JavaScript modules, right? So everything is in the separate little files. All the components are separate, right? So that's awesome, but still keeping that in full sync is a little bit difficult. It takes a little bit of refactoring. So I would say, just to answer the question and sum it up, ideal state is to have full sync between the code repository and design repository. If you cannot have it immediately, just like we can't right now at UXPin, then just do what you can, right, and go step by step. So our first step is to keep CSS and all the style sheets, right, less style sheets, in sync with our design assets. And then after we'll complete that, we'll take care of JavaScript as well, right? So think about design system as a process, not as an end game on its own, right? And as a process, like, it has parts, naturally. Right.
Right. And there's a question here actually that That's actually from Mikolaj, and I think this is a really interesting scenario and very relevant, which is how do you encourage developers to read documentation and check all the details, even if you're using something like spec mode? Because in his company, they seem to only listen to the briefing at the grooming meeting, and then they don't really read the specification because there's just too much text for them.
Interesting. So I think the key to answering this question is really in the last sentence, right? So if there's too much text for them, then I would say that this is might not be an optimal documentation, right? Because documentation should serve developers, so should be optimized to their needs. And needs might vary team to team. Like some teams might actually prefer more comprehensive documentation, and fine, then we have to provide it in some way, right? Some teams might just need, like CSS properties or or just some basic guidelines, and that's good enough for them. So I would suggest that you should work on the documentation, on the shape of documentation with your developers, so you can actually deliver what they expect. And I know it's easier said than done. Like I lived through all the pains of working with developers who would just, like towards the end of the sprint, would deliver something completely different than what we planned at the beginning of the sprint. Happened to me many times. But we should just keep trying and keep adjusting our process and our documentation to needs of development, because our documentation is supposed to serve them, right?
Right, right. And actually, speaking of design systems, we have another question here that's more about timing, which is there a certain stage of the development process when it makes sense to build a design system, or do you need to have all of that documentation ready before you even get into it?
So a good time to build a design system is really last sprint. It's always like it's always behind us. I mean, like it's never too early to build a design system. So here's the thing: design system should be treated just like any other agile project, right? So it should have sprints, right? And at the end of every sprint, you deliver something that is immediately usable to the rest of the team. So in my last Medium article, I described how we spend a sprint working just on the color palette. This color palette is already represented in our last files. It's already being used by the team, right? So although that doesn't deliver the full consistency across all of our products, right? At least we made the first step to make the experience a little bit more consistent, right? So don't treat design system as something that's supposed to be just done and then sent to the team. It's always a process, and every single sprint should deliver something that's useful, even if it increases the consistency just by like 5%, right? That's fine. Like it's a process. Gradually, you're building the system to have a fully consistent experience and really fast development.
Right. And let's see here. So we've got another question here about. Got it. So Scott had a question that's more related to our product itself, which is how does UX Pin handle documentation of edge cases? So how do you usually go about describing possible compromises or legal guidelines?
Exactly. Yes. So edge case, like it depends if that's an edge case of the just on the interface end or somewhere in between, like design and development. What I mean by the first one is that sometimes your design should be tested with extreme data. You know what I mean? It's just like I remember from my days in e-commerce, we would make at the very beginning lots of mistakes about product names, because we would assume that product name, it will take one line of text, it can't be really longer, and we would design everything with one line of text, and then different data would come to the interface and just break everything, right? So we started to design always as in a separate place. In the process, we design extreme data input, right? So a product name that takes 3 lines of text, and that would be an edge case just from the pure interface standpoint. But then there are edge cases on the verge of design and development, meaning that sometimes the interface on its own can take a state that is an edge case. It hardly ever happens, but in that particular case, it might actually break, right? And if you don't want to, if you don't have the time or you don't have a need to really design this edge case, then I would just drop it as part of the contextual documentation. Developers should know about it. It might be might be a crucial part of the development process to actually plan for this edge case. But if you don't have to design it, just a couple of sentences of a description and they will have this information, right? And like with a situation like that, it also depends on your team structure, because sometimes if this is like not a very probable edge case, right? And if you can actually just go to developer and talk to your developer about this particular case, that might be good enough as well. If it gets complicated, then it has to be part of the contextual documentation.
Gotcha. And so this is actually a pretty common question. I think it's useful to mention, which is, what's the difference between a design system that you're talking about and a conventional style guide? Because a conventional style guide sometimes also describes UI components and pieces of code as well.
So the main difference is that design system keeps everything in sync, design and development, and it's a process run alongside your product development, right? So design system is comprehensive. Style guides, typically when people describe style guides, they're just focused on the visual aspects of an interface, right? So what is the color palette? What is the typographic scale? What are the icons? How do you use the logo of a company? And that typically is actually part of a design system, but it's only one part, right? Design systems add to that the whole spectrum of UI patterns synced with code, and then all the guidelines around how a company actually builds their interface. Now, why this is important, why this is such a dramatic shift in the process. Back in the days, like style guides were static. So a team would work on putting a style guide together, and it was just supposed to be a reference point for the rest of the company whenever they're building something. Design system, on the other hand, is dynamically built by the entire team, meaning that product teams are suggesting patterns constantly to a design system. It keeps growing. You could say that design system is really an organism. And then with all these rules, like the rules that I described, do's and don'ts or editorial guidelines, they're meant to be part of a design system to help product teams build new parts of the design system, so it can just grow and always serve needs of the team.
Right. And so somebody else then has a question. Is a design system the same then as a living style guide?
Yeah, that's a terminology thing. So some people are calling design system living style guides. There's a little bit of a mess, as always, in our industry with names, but living style guides is very close to a design system. Although some companies, when they refer to living style guide, it means that the style guide is actually derived from code, and that's the living component, right? So it's a style guide that always represents what is present on the production servers, right? So there are different tools that are used to create this kind of living style guides, and design system has this very important design component, right? So it's not only representing what is on production servers, but also what is the current state of affairs on the design end, and provides assets for designers to be used, right? But these terms are very, very close. I noticed that some companies are actually using them, just shifting between one or the other. And also design language is another topic which is somehow getting close. To give you an example, IBM started with defining their design language, which ended up to be more of a style guide, more or less. And then they just recently launched a new design system, IBM Carbon, which I recommend you guys check out. Very, very interesting approach to building a system. So these terms get mixed. What I would like to suggest is just calling this comprehensive approach to building and maintaining consistency to your company as a design system, because the system part of the name really defines what it is. Like with a language or living style guide, we are getting confused with different things. I think design system is the clearest term that we have.
Right, right. And let's see here. So somebody here is curious. Have you found that less and SAS are particularly helpful in a design system?
Could you say it again, Jerry? I mean, like you broke my
have you
sense.
found that less and SAS are particularly helpful for a design system?
I mean, like I cannot. I mean, like it's really hard to imagine a design system without any preprocessors. Let's say that on the CSS end. Like defining variables, mixes, functions, right? Directly on your style sheets. Of course, good imports of all the individual style sheets into one major style sheet. Like this is so crucial. So I would say that if you don't use any preprocessors and you're thinking about building a design system, I would start actually with style sheets. It's an interesting thing. Like I personally use SAS. That's just like a weapon of choice. But as UX Spin, we use less. They're very similar. Then some companies actually these days use different approaches to put CSS directly into JavaScript files to just keep all these components fully encapsulated, which is an interesting concept. Which I never use, but I mean, it's just in theory, it sounds very interesting to me. Although sometimes somehow scary to keep your styles in the JavaScript file, but I get the point of actually having this fully encapsulated components. But you cannot just use like classic CSS in a design system. That sounds like a nightmare to manage. Like how do you separate different classes into component files and put them together? That sounds really bad. So yeah, use some kind of preprocessors, whether that's SAS, stylus, or less. That's up to you. In my opinion, that's a matter of personal preference.
Got it. And somebody here actually has a question about they're currently in the process of creating a design system for their insurance company.
Whoa.
And this person's facing a pretty large challenge in terms of bringing consistency across UI components. So how have you seen that being resolved in terms of creating one consistent set of UI components for web, iOS, and Android?
So this is an interesting challenge. So I would start with this part of the system that I call building blocks, right? So the most basic properties. Start with your color palette, typographic settings, and then what really works well for cross-platform environments, which we don't have at UX Spin, right? We are 100% web, but for cross-platform environments. What I would recommend is keeping all these basic building blocks in design tokens files. So you basically keep all your styles as serialized data, so JSON or YAML. And then Salesforce actually has a nice open source tool called Theo. And Theo lets you translate automatically design tokens files into different style sheets for different platforms, right? So one example that they keep giving us is that if you have your design tokens and your color palette with Theo, their open source tool, every single time you're building styles for Android, it's going to translate all the color definitions directly to Android format, which is this weird, weird code. I never actually coded anything for Android. I designed for Android. And then if you are working on iOS, you will get RGBA, right? So that little tool actually makes this part automatic for you, and you just keep all your styles definition in this design tokens files as a serialized data. I know that sounds very technical. I'm going to actually publish a little Medium post probably tomorrow about this part of the process. So although we didn't decide to use design tokens just yet at UX Spin, just not to overload our team with implementation of a completely new data format. Like that was our main argument against it. That was a little bit much to take. We are actually keeping track of all these micro properties in our style sheets through a set of mixins and variables, right? And then we are translating that into different formats. So The article should be published tomorrow.
Got it. And now let's go back to another earlier question, which is, and I think this is really relevant, which is if you're on a really tight timeline, what parts of the Agile UX process is it okay to skip or maybe condense?
Oh, wow. Like my design heart and mind will tell you one thing: do not skip research. So that's typically that's the third thing that gets butchered, but it should be the last thing. I would rather take smaller scope than skip the research. And this is what we are always trying to do at UXPin, and gosh, it's hard, right? We had to separate our UX research from UX design roles just to make sure that we have an ongoing research practice, right? And designers can take results of this research and it's always ready for them so they can work on designs. So don't skip that. I would rather limit the scope. Another interesting thing in Agile development that is frequently just overlooked by product managers is that it's not only that we have scope, timeline, and that's it when we are manipulating the schedule of a project. You can always rethink the way you're doing certain features, right? You can find compromises on the tech end. You can find compromises on the design end just to speed it up, right? So if there are time constraints, I would try to manipulate those methods to really deliver on time, right? But do not compromise research. So there's not like one part that you can think, like, okay, that's not necessary. Maybe I'll skip that. It's rather about the substance of a project. I would say that this is giving you some space for optimization.
Right. And we have another question here. So let's see. So this is a really relevant question, which is how to keep business rules documented without just stacks of documentation in the Agile process.
So it depends on what do you mean by this business documentation. But the way we do it, we just keep it in this short PRD, right? And it's typically a page or two. We never had a need at UXPin to produce very comprehensive documentation. I would say that if you have to build documentation that just runs pages, hundreds of pages long, then there's something wrong with the process of building software at the company, right? So are sprints too long? Do you have sprints, right? Are projects just planned without involving teams in the planning process? That's a possibility. I've seen that happening. But I would say that if you are serious about running Agile UX process, then you want to make sure that the documentation is really short and it's just focused on the most important factors. And as I mentioned, in our case, the most important means describing goals and the success of the project, describing user stories, and then PMs are adding dependencies and schedule for every project. And that's really it on the business side, right? Another tool that I like to use, it wasn't in the presentation, but I personally really enjoy using something called CPS hypothesis to describe any business problem. It's a very minimalistic way to describing any project, right? So CPS stands for customer problem solution. So whenever I'm thinking about a new project, I'm thinking, okay, who is the customer, possible customer? What is the problem? And it's just like one sentence long for every letter, right? CPS. And then solution, what is the general idea of a solution? And I've never found a need to actually, on this level, describe it in detail. So I would rather take CPS hypothesis, go to the team and work with them on this short PRD and then directly on prototypes, right? And testing them with users rather than focus on building documentation. Having that said, I never worked in heavily regulated industry. I never worked in healthcare. I never worked in financial services. So I know that in these particular cases, documentation might be much heavier, right? Because there's plenty of constraints. So then you have to extend the short PRD to involve that, right? And then I would think always about moving at least part of this documentation to this contextualized documentation to empower developers to work on particular pieces of the project, right? So I would try to avoid really long documentation as much as I can, but then in some industries, you might end up with slightly longer documents than what I presented.
Right, right. And let's go into our last few questions here. So Will actually brings up a very relevant situation that I think a lot of designers face, which is what is the right amount of design documentation for a project and in like what form? So prototypes, specs, etc. So in his situation, he's working with offshore developers on a different time schedule. So it's almost like what we face here at UXPin, right? And so he says it's difficult to meet design expectations if there's not enough documentation, but then there's not enough time in the day to get all that right documentation. So where do you find that balance?
Oh, that's a very interesting challenge, right? So with distributed teams, but especially if there's a split between design and development, you have to err on the side of having more documentation, right? But I would say that the first step in order to actually get it right is just scheduling a call with the development team, just focus on the shape of the documentation that actually works for them. So developer is always a stakeholder for any kind of design documentation, right? So that's the crucial thing to consider, right? And like in the past, I used to treat design documentation as my part of the process, something that I'm doing for myself, but that's that's false, right? It's being done for developers. So I would suggest talking to them first. What do they need, right? And then depending on their needs, if the documentation gets extra lengthy, right, what I would try to do is minimize it as much as I can, and then schedule walkthroughs for the team. If that's impossible, then try to maybe record video walkthroughs. I've seen that happening and working very well as well on different projects. And one important notion here, I would not treat ever prototypes as a documentation for anything. Prototypes are great for tests with users. If you just send prototypes to developers, especially if there's a distribution between design and development across different time zones, then you are risking that something will get just interpreted in a different way that you planned it, right? Because prototype is, like it's a reflection of the final product, but it's not the final product, and it's really hard to derive all the information that developers need from a prototype, so they tend to be very creative with it, right? And it will look differently than you planned or imagined. So what I would suggest is using this contextualized documentation to just drop notes describing certain parts of the documentation, and then planning walkthroughs if your team needs more, right? More information.
Gotcha. And now, since we are coming up pretty close to 30 minutes past the hour, what a great session. Thank you, everybody, for the great questions. We'll take the last question here. And this one, I think, is something that that you might have even faced this before, which is, so Scott works with designers in multiple teams where integration of design styles is hard and often hits quite a few roadblocks. So what would you suggest is a good foundation for taking everyone's sort of unique style or approach to design and coming up with a uniform language?
Oh yeah, that is a difficult challenge. So if you can, Scott, I don't know if that's possible for you, but I would think about forming a design operations team that is going to take care of the task of actually building a system for the company. And with unifying styles, what we found really useful is actually using data in the decision-making process, right? So we had this whole discussion when we started to work on our color palette, for example, at UXPin. There are different opinions about what are the primary colors, like should we have this shade of gray or the other one? And what we found super useful is actually to check how many different colors are being used across different products, you know, like in what context. So we are trying to use data to argue for certain solutions with the team. And the difficulty, and this is why design operations is a separate part of our team at UXPin, and I always suggest that this is the best solution, is that this team serves product teams, meaning that you have to, like, design operations team must make product teams happy, right? And of course, there's always a need for compromise, but you have to think about the product teams as your clients and stakeholders. So in our case, with the color palette, when we start to unify the palette, our senior design staff was kind of unhappy with the result. You know, like they didn't like the shade of gray. So we had to have the whole discussion about, okay, why we are so unhappy? You know, like it seems like this is the most used shade of gray in our interface. And then they tell us that they plan to change it, and they want to actually start working with different shades of gray. So we had to have this whole discussion, and then towards the end, we just agreed on a solution, right? So there was a need for a certain compromise, but also as design operations, we felt that we have to work with the product team to make them happy, because otherwise they're not going to use our color palette. You know what I mean? It's just like this is the very important part of the whole process of unification of any styles at the company.
Right, right. And I think on that note, we will close out the session. Thank you, everybody, for all these fantastic questions here. We had over 180 questions asked during the session.
Wow.
So unfortunately, yeah, we couldn't get to all of them, but the conversation does continue on our Slack channel. So if you have worked on a product team for more than 3 years, we encourage you to apply for our Slack team. Right now we have over 3,000 designers, developers, and product managers, and the channel name is called Product Tribes. So here is the link that I just dropped in there, and let me drop it again because it didn't seem to hyperlink. There you go. And so, yeah, if you're an experienced designer, developer, or product manager, feel free to apply. And on that note, thanks everybody for joining us today. Next week, we have Stephanie Ruiz from Salesforce talking about how they designed a CSS framework for the enterprise, so for use across all of Salesforce. So a very large scale design and development challenge. And that will be at the same time, 10 a.m. Pacific time next Wednesday. Hope to see you guys all there as well. And yeah, thanks again, everybody, for coming with questions. And we really hope to see you at the rest of this webinar series. Yep, take care, everybody.